TV and radio as we continue to do an analysis here in the final 3 weeks of this election of what exactly the demographic makeup of it could ultimately look like as we consider who will come out the winner. And there was a bunch of new polling over this weekend that showed a tight race nationally between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, statistically tied, perhaps not too surprising, although it may be more surprising the degree to which it does seem to have tightened as of late. But I was also struck, Joe, by the new New York Times Siena poll that looked at black voters specifically.
Yep.
Nearly 8 out of 10 black voters nationwide said they would vote for Harris. That is an improvement from where Joe Biden was before he left the race at just 74%. But then you look back to 2020 when Joe Biden picked up 90% of black voters in his very narrow victory. Kamala Harris is not yet back at where Joe Biden was last cycle.
15% of black voters said they plan to vote for Donald Trump, a 6-point increase from 4 years ago. This is very perplexing for the Harris campaign. And I know it's something that you talked about with Quentin James in the late edition of Balance of Power on Friday. Before we bring in Rick and Jeannie, see, I'm watching even when I'm not here. Political strategist, the Collective PAC. Listen to what Quentin had to say.
I think the Republicans and Donald Trump have done a good job of engaging black men, of going after the black vote. One of my criticisms of the Democrats, and I'm a Democrat and proud of it, is that we haven't spent enough money and done enough work to engage black men on these questions around the economy, on things beyond kind of policing and criminal justice. Those things are important as well. But how do we actually again raise wages, improve work, and build wealth for black men? Those are big concerns. And so there have been efforts from the right to, sometimes confuse, but sometimes persuade black men. And so we got to acknowledge that and recognize that and go out there and work hard and earn their vote.
It's one of the data points that has people feeling differently this morning and today. If we get back to the overall narrative that we began with, and our political panel back with us now, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis. Rick is, of course, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie is political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Thanks to both of you for being here. We're looking forward to picking your brains on this. Jeannie, did the world feel different? What happened over the weekend? Was it just these key constituencies, young black men for Harris, suburban women for Trump, that make people feel like the ground is shifting beneath their feet?
Yeah, some people are describing this as a vibe shift. For me, as I step back, I think the race has tightened back to where it would have been if Joe Biden hadn't been at the top of the ticket initially. We always knew it was going to be a race. It is a very tight race. We know there is an enormous gender gap, and you were just talking about the gap on black voters. And Kayleigh's point from the New York Times poll is absolutely true. Kamala Harris is back from where Joe Biden was earlier in this race, but not back to where he was in 2020. And I'm quite frankly not sure if she's going to get there. And this is why, because we're talking about black men, sort of focusing on the aspect of that. But it is a male aspect that we need to think about. Men across the board favor Donald Trump as women favor Kamala Harris in large numbers. So one thing I think Kamala Harris needs to think about is, yes, appeal to black men, but she's got to close the gap with men overall. And that means focusing, just where Clinton was talking about, on the economy, jobs, inflation, cost of living.
Well, so let's look further at some new proposals that she's put out today with aim at addressing this specifically with black men. A new program for black entrepreneurs would provide 1 million loans that are fully forgivable up to $20,000, according to the campaign. She also pledged to support a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency, which, according to surveys, 20% of black Americans own. She also vowed to work with Congress to legalize recreational marijuana and make sure black men are able to create businesses and access jobs in the cannabis industry. Rick, does any of that pull more black men onto her side?
It could, but I just want to put it in perspective. Trump is getting more young black men than he got in 2020, let's say 25%. That is 1% of the electorate, and even less than 1% of the electorate in the targeted swing states. So it's 1/10 of 1% that is moving inside this cohort of electorate. Um, that's not really what's driving it. Jeannie, I think, picked on really the big issue, and that is you've got a divide along education, voters with college educations and voters that don't, that are defining this election. And the biggest spike that's occurred since this election started is a massive female gender gap that now exists in this campaign. I mean, Harris is getting, probably 40% more white women than Biden had in 2020, and the decline slightly with the number of white males supporting Trump. So it's a different look at this election if you really start slicing and dicing the big muscle movements, and that is, along those lines.
So speak to the psychology shift then, Rick, and what it's like to be inside a campaign on a day like this. What causes people who are paying attention to wake up 3 Mondays before the election and feel differently than they did when they left work on Friday? Is it the polling data that came out from over the weekend? Is it the messaging that we heard from the two campaigns, or the fact that this thing is still tied?
Well, it could be they're all hungover. I mean, this might have been a big weekend of parties. I don't know. But the reality is, as we talked before, 3 weeks is an election, right? They're voting in almost every one of these targeted states now. It gets tight. Campaigns seize up. It's harder and harder to make decisions. There are fewer and fewer decisions to be made. And so everyone's running around trying to figure out what they can do and what's left to do. And really, at the end of the day, the campaign is pretty much baked at this point. I'm a little surprised that the Harris campaign isn't more aggressive. Doing one event a day is not what I would call diving to the finish. And I think this is what they have to worry about, is that Donald Trump is very good at sort of packing the schedule and doing more toward the end of the campaign. I mean, a month ago, he was playing golf and having a great time and doing 2 events a week. He has stepped up his schedule significantly. So somebody's got to try to grab what little momentum might exist in a dead heat race like this. But we rarely see elections this close. We didn't see it coming this close in 2020. And this is a unique election. It's different than 2020, but it's just as close. And so it's going to be very hard for campaigns to get comfortable between now and the end of this thing.
Well, if we consider the schedule here, Jeannie, it's not just organized campaign events, but also more interviews we're seeing Kamala Harris do, including scheduled for Wednesday evening, Fox News. She's sitting down with Bret Baier. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think she is recognizing a couple things. Number one, voters are registering in larger numbers with the Republican Party. This is an important switch we have seen in the United States. So that number right there means she's got to appeal to those voters, and she won't pull off a lot of them, but even a few would be helpful. So those are those Nikki Haley or Never Trump Republicans, if you will. So that does make sense. But I think since time is so short, I do think she's got to be careful of putting herself on a journalist schedule. This is not about the media and us whining we want her to do more interviews. This is about her appealing to a very small number of voters in these swing states, like probably under 1 million. And to do that, she's going to have to reach them where she is. And I mean this in all sincerity, and I'd say this whether I was on Bloomberg or not. She's got to get her message out on the economy, which means, yes, go to Fox, but come to Bloomberg as well. Donald Trump is, and you should be too, because that's the number one issue, according to Gallup, in 8 or 9 out of 10 voters' minds. And her message on that has not been persuasive at this point.
That's right. And we are going to have a conversation at noontime Eastern tomorrow with former President Donald Trump here on this network on Bloomberg TV and radio. Message to the Harris campaign. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is calling. We'll meet you here on Bloomberg. Rick, I am very curious about the way you look at the closing opportunity for new ideas here. Kamala Harris, as Kayleigh mentioned, 1 million small business loans forgivable of up to $20,000 to try to get the attention of young black men, training and mentorship programs for in-demand jobs, focusing on health issues disproportionately affecting black men. And then finally, yes, federally legalizing marijuana. Whether that seems a little too on the nose or between the eyes for you here, you can weigh in on that if you want, Rick. But I'm just curious, with 3 weeks to go, is there still time, if you're staging closing arguments to be appealing to specific demographics with new ideas?
Probably not. I get why they're doing it. They rolled out, Barack Obama last week to lecture young black males about their responsibility to vote for Kamala Harris. I'm not sure how effective that was. So they've doubled down to sort of give a carrot after the stick approach, and maybe they needed to do that just to stem some negatives that might have been seen in the polling over the weekend based on the Obama lecture. But the bottom line is, what's really going to turn the election at this stage is get out to vote. And generating some of that momentum. So these policy prescriptions are very, very patchwork at this point. You're not going to have these. I bet you'll never see this in a TV ad, for instance, in any of the inner cities of America that might be seeing some of the declines with young black men. But the reality is that doing voter contact and getting these absentee ballots in is really the key to the success. You can literally win the election between now and election day by doing the proper ground game. And I think that's where both campaigns are clearly focused. There's been a bigger investment dollar-wise by the Harris campaign. But this is Elon Musk's latest venture into politics, is running the ground game for Trump. And so we're going to see just how effective he is. We know he can land a rocket in a pair of chopsticks, but the question is, can he actually turn out the vote for the Trump campaign?
Yeah, is that rocket science too? Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, our signature political panel. Thank you both so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. We'll have much more still ahead, especially when it comes to how markets are viewing this election here on Bloomberg.